Commander Zephyx clicked his mandibles in satisfaction as he watched the human prisoner being dragged through the corridors of the hegemony battleship. The creature walked upright on two legs, its pale skin covered in simple cloth garments that had seen better days. Unlike the other species they had conquered, this one showed no signs of fear or submission. Its dark eyes remained steady, almost curious, as it observed everything around it. Another defiant one, Zephyx muttered to his second-in-command, Officer Kralix. These humans never learned their place in the natural order. The human had been captured during the raid on the third planet of what the locals called the Sol system. Earth, they named it. An insignificant blue world that had dared to resist the hegemony's expansion. Most species surrendered immediately when they witnessed the power of their plasma cannons and shield technology. The humans had fought back with primitive kinetic weapons and nuclear devices. Amusing, really. This particular specimen had been found in what appeared to be a military installation, surrounded by the bodies of several hegemony soldiers. The creature had fought with nothing but basic projectile weapons and some kind of explosive devices. 3 of their elite warriors had fallen before they managed to subdue it with stun nets. Such tenacity was both admirable and foolish. "Sir, shall we proceed with the standard interrogation protocols?" Kralix asked, his 4 eyes blinking in sequence. Zephyx considered this. They had already extracted most of the useful information they needed from other human captives. This one seemed different, though. There was something in its posture, the way it carried itself, that suggested it might prove more entertaining than the others. "No," Zephyx decided. "I have a better idea. Signal the entertainment deck. Prepare the dragon pit for a special presentation." Kralix's antennae twitched with excitement. The dragon pit was their most popular form of entertainment. A vast arena where they kept the most dangerous predators from across the galaxy. Originally designed as an execution method for the most defiant prisoners, it had evolved into a spectacle that drew crowds from every ship in the fleet. The dragons themselves were magnificent creatures, standing nearly 4 meters tall with scales that could deflect most energy weapons. Their teeth could bite through solid metal, and their claws had torn apart everything from armored war mechs to the toughest alien hides. In the 5 years since they had captured the beasts from the volcanic world of Pyraxis, nothing thrown into their pit had survived longer than 30 seconds. Word spread quickly through the ship. Within an hour, the observation deck above the dragon pit was packed with hegemony personnel eager to watch another execution. The betting pools were already forming, with most wagers focused on how many pieces the human would be torn into rather than how long it might survive. The human, whose name they had learned was Marcus Chen, was led to the preparation chamber overlooking the pit. Through the reinforced transparent aluminum viewing panel, he could see the massive arena below. The space was roughly circular, about 50 meters across, with high walls that even the dragons couldn't scale. Scattered across the floor were the bleached bones of previous victims, a testament to the futility of resistance. 3 dragons prowled the arena floor. Each one was a different subspecies from Pyraxis. The largest was a crimson devastator, its red scales gleaming like fresh blood. Its companion was a smaller but more agile shadowstalker, its dark hide allowing it to blend with the shadows cast by the arena's lighting. The third was a golden berserker, known for its unpredictable rage and tendency to attack anything that moved. Magnificent, aren't they? Zephyx had arrived to personally oversee the entertainment. These creatures have never been tamed. They recognize only strength and they bow to nothing. Watch how they treat your kind. Marcus studied the dragons with the same calm expression he had maintained since his capture. "Impressive animals," he said simply. "They remind me of something from back home." Several of the watching aliens chittered with amusement at the humans' apparent delusion, as if anything on that backwater planet could compare to the apex predators of Pyraxis. "You speak as if you've encountered their like before," Zephyx said, curious despite himself. "Not exactly like them," Marcus replied, still watching the dragons move below. "But I grew up around dangerous animals. My grandfather ran a wildlife sanctuary, spent most of my childhood learning how to read animal behavior, how to approach them without triggering their defensive instincts." The aliens exchanged glances. This human actually believed it could apply some primitive animal handling techniques to apex predators that had killed dozens of trained warriors. "Your grandfather's pets won't help you down there," Officer Kralix observed. "These are killing machines, pure and simple." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Every animal is a killing machine when it's afraid or threatened. The trick is understanding what they're really afraid of. Commander Zephyx had heard enough. The human's confidence was beginning to annoy him. It was time to demonstrate the futility of resistance. "Begin the process," he ordered. The preparation chamber's floor began to retract, revealing a chute that led directly into the dragon pit. Marcus looked down at the opening, then back at the assembled aliens. For the first time since his capture, he smiled. "Just out of curiosity," Marcus said, "what happens to you if I somehow survive down there?" The question was so absurd that several aliens burst into laughter. Zephyx himself couldn't suppress a clicking sound of amusement. "Survive? Human, nothing has ever survived the dragon pit. But if by some impossible miracle you did, I suppose we would have to reconsider our assessment of your species." "Good to know," Marcus said, and stepped forward into the chute. As he slid down toward the arena floor, the aliens pressed against the viewing windows, eager to watch the spectacle unfold. The betting pools closed, the odds heavily favoring death within the first 10 seconds. After all, what could one unarmed human possibly do against 3 of the galaxy's most feared predators? They were about to find out. Marcus hit the sand-covered floor of the arena harder than expected, rolling to absorb the impact as he had been trained. The chute sealed above him with a metallic clang, cutting off the excited chattering of the alien spectators. Silence filled the arena except for the low, rumbling sounds of the dragons somewhere in the shadows. He stayed in his crouch for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the different lighting while taking stock of his situation. The arena smelled of old death and something else, a musky, sulfurous scent that had to come from the dragons themselves. Scattered bones crunched softly under his boots as he slowly stood up. The 3 predators had gone still the moment he entered their domain. He could see them now, positioned at roughly equal distances around the circular arena. They were even more impressive up close than they had appeared from above. The Crimson Devastator stood nearly 4.5 meters tall, its massive head swiveling to track his movements. Its partner, the Shadow Stalker, had partially melted into the darkness near the arena wall, only its glowing yellow eyes visible. The Golden Berserker paced restlessly, its claws scraping against the stone floor with each step. Above, he could hear the aliens placing last-minute bets and making crude jokes about how many bites it would take to finish him off. Commander Zephyx's voice carried clearly through the arena's acoustics as he narrated the scene for the entertainment of his crew. Marcus ignored the commentary and focused entirely on the dragons. This was the critical moment. Everything depended on how he handled the next few seconds. Most people, when faced with apex predators, made the same fundamental mistake. They either froze in terror or made aggressive movements that triggered the animal's hunting instincts. Both responses usually ended the same way, but Marcus had learned something different during his years at his grandfather's sanctuary. The biggest, most dangerous animals were often the most afraid. He began to move, but not in any direction the watching aliens expected. Instead of backing toward the wall or searching for a weapon among the scattered bones, Marcus walked steadily toward the center of the arena. His movements were slow and deliberate, his shoulders relaxed, his hands visible and empty. The Crimson Devastator responded first, letting out a deep, thrumming roar that Marcus felt in his chest. It was a warning sound, designed to intimidate potential threats into submission or flight. The other 2 dragons took up the call, their voices joining in a harmony that had probably been the last thing countless victims had heard. Marcus stopped walking and went perfectly still. He didn't turn away from the sound or cringe from its intensity. Instead, he listened to it with the kind of focused attention his grandfather had taught him to use with the big cats back home. Every roar, every growl, every subtle shift in tone carried information about the animal's emotional state. What he heard surprised him. Beneath the aggression and the territorial display, there was something else. Uncertainty. These dragons weren't just apex predators ruling their domain. They were prisoners just like he was. The realization changed everything. When the roaring stopped, Marcus did something that caused a stunned silence to fall over the watching aliens. He sat down in the sand cross-legged and waited. "What is the human doing?" Officer Kralix's voice carried clearly through the arena speakers. "Has it given up already?" Commander Zephyx was equally confused. Perhaps the shock has broken its mind. I've seen it happen with some species when faced with overwhelming predators. But Marcus wasn't broken. He was thinking. The dragons were studying him with the same intensity he was using to study them. The Crimson Devastator had tilted its massive head to one side, clearly puzzled by behavior it had never encountered before. The Shadow Stalker had emerged slightly from the darkness, its curiosity overriding its camouflage instincts. Even the volatile Golden Berserker had stopped pacing to stare at the strange creature that had just sat down in the middle of its hunting ground. Minutes passed. The alien spectators grew restless, expecting violence and carnage, not this bizarre standoff. Some began calling for the handlers to prod the dragons into action with their electric staves. Marcus continued to wait. He had learned patience from watching his grandfather work with traumatized animals that had been rescued from illegal fighting rings and private collections. Sometimes the kindest thing you could do for a frightened predator was to simply exist in its space without making demands or threats. The first dragon to move was the Shadow Stalker. It emerged fully from its hiding spot and began a slow, cautious approach. Its steps were careful, testing, ready to spring back if the human proved to be some kind of trap. Above, the aliens leaned forward against the viewing windows. This was unprecedented. The dragons never showed curiosity toward their victims. They hunted, they killed, they fed, and they returned to their resting spots. They didn't investigate. When the Shadow Stalker was about 3 meters away, it stopped and lowered its head, sniffing the air around Marcus. Its nostrils flared as it processed the human scent. Searching for the fear hormones and stress chemicals that usually marked prey animals, Marcus knew what the dragon was looking for, and he consciously controlled his breathing and heart rate, using techniques he had learned during his military training. Fear was a chemical signature that predators could detect from considerable distances. If he could mask that signature, he might be able to change the entire dynamic of the encounter. The Shadow Stalker's confusion was evident in its body language. Its head tilted from side to side as it tried to categorize this strange creature that smelled wrong and acted wrong and didn't fit any of its instinctual prey patterns. After several more minutes of careful observation, the dragon did something that caused gasps of amazement from the watching aliens. It lowered itself into a resting position, still watching Marcus but no longer treating him as either threat or prey. The change in the Shadow Stalker's behavior triggered responses from the other 2 dragons. The Crimson Devastator approached more boldly, while the Golden Berserker's restless energy seemed to be shifting from aggressive to curious. Marcus remained perfectly still, letting the massive predators investigate him on their own terms. He was beginning to understand something about these creatures that their alien captors had never grasped. They weren't just killing machines. They were intelligent beings trapped in an artificial environment, forced to perform violence for the entertainment of their captors. Just like any intelligent being would be, they were probably desperate for something different, something that didn't follow the predictable pattern of fear, aggression, and death that had defined their existence for years. Marcus smiled slightly as the Crimson Devastator settled down beside its companion. He had found the key to the dragon's behavior, and it wasn't dominance or submission, it was understanding. The Golden Berserker was the most challenging of the 3 dragons. While its companions had settled into watchful curiosity, the golden-scaled creature continued to pace in increasingly tight circles around Marcus and the other 2 dragons. Its movements were jerky and unpredictable, and Marcus could see the deep scars that covered its hide, evidence of countless forced battles in this very arena. Marcus recognized the signs. This dragon had been driven beyond its natural behavioral patterns by prolonged stress and artificial stimulation. The alien handlers had probably used pain-inducing devices to make it more aggressive for their entertainment, not understanding that they were breaking the creature's natural psychological balance. Above them, the alien spectators were growing agitated. Commander Zephix's voice echoed through the arena with increasing irritation. Why aren't they attacking? Use the neural stimulators to trigger their hunting responses. Sir, came Officer Kralix's uncertain reply. The handlers report that the dragons aren't responding to standard stimulation. Their brain activity patterns are unusual. Marcus heard this exchange and filed it away. Neural stimulators. Pain-based conditioning. These aliens had been torturing the dragons to make them perform. No wonder the creatures were confused by his peaceful approach. The golden berserker's pacing was becoming more frantic. Marcus could see the internal conflict playing out in its behavior. Years of conditioned aggression warring against its natural intelligence and curiosity. The dragon was fighting its own programmed responses, and the effort was clearly causing it distress. Moving very slowly, Marcus extended one hand palm up toward the agitated creature. It was a gesture his grandfather had taught him, non-threatening, offering rather than demanding, leaving the choice entirely up to the animal. The response was immediate and dramatic. The golden berserker froze mid-stride, its head snapping toward Marcus with laser focus. For a moment, the arena was utterly silent except for the creature's heavy breathing. Then something remarkable happened. The dragon's eyes, which had been wild and unfocused, seemed to clear. The constant tension in its muscles began to ease, and for the first time since Marcus had entered the pit, the golden berserker stopped moving entirely. "Impossible," Commander Zephyx breathed, his voice carrying clearly through the arena's audio system. "Nothing has ever calmed a berserker once its rage cycle begins." But Marcus was already moving to the next phase of his approach. Still moving slowly, he began to speak to the dragons in low, steady tones. Not words. They wouldn't understand human language, but the kind of meaningless sounds his grandfather had used with the big cats. Rhythmic, soothing vocalizations that carried emotional content rather than semantic meaning. The effect on all three dragons was profound. Their breathing synchronized with his voice patterns, and Marcus could see their stress levels dropping visibly. The Crimson Devastator actually closed its eyes, something that prey animals never did in the presence of a potential threat. More importantly, Marcus was beginning to understand the deeper truth about these creatures. They weren't just animals. They were showing signs of complex, emotional intelligence that suggested they might be closer to sentient beings than anyone had realized. He tested this theory by shifting his vocal patterns to include what sounded like questions, rising tones that left space for responses. The Shadowstalker was the first to react, making a low, harmonic sound that seemed to echo Marcus's rhythm while adding its own variations. Within minutes, all three dragons were participating in what could only be described as a conversation. They were taking turns, listening to each other, responding to subtle changes in tone and inflection. It was a sophisticated communication system that their alien captors had never bothered to discover. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. These weren't just intelligent predators. They were potentially sentient beings who had been enslaved and tortured for entertainment. The aliens had built their entire society around the assumption that only they possessed true intelligence, never bothering to test that assumption with other species. The conversation between Marcus and the dragons continued for nearly an hour. Gradually, he began to introduce simple physical movements into the exchange, hand gestures, shifts in posture, basic body language that seemed to translate across species barriers. The dragons responded with their own physical vocabulary. The Crimson Devastator showed submission by lowering its massive head to Marcus's level. The Shadowstalker demonstrated trust by fully exposing its vulnerable belly. Most remarkably, the Golden Berserker began to mimic some of Marcus's hand movements with its own claws, showing an understanding of symbolic communication that should have been impossible for a mere animal. Above them, the alien spectators had fallen into confused silence. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was something they didn't understand and couldn't categorize. Some were calling for the event to be terminated, while others demanded that the handlers force the dragons to attack. Commander Zephyx was facing a crisis of understanding. Everything his species believed about the natural order was being challenged by what he was witnessing. If these dragons were truly intelligent, if they were capable of communication and complex thought, then what did that say about the hegemony's treatment of other species? "Sir," Officer Kralix reported with barely concealed panic, "the Xenobiology Department is requesting immediate access to the arena. They want to study these interaction patterns." "Denied," Zephyx snapped. "This is some kind of trick. Humans are primitives. They couldn't possibly be communicating with apex predators." But even as he said the words, Zephyx could see that something extraordinary was happening below. The human wasn't just surviving in the dragon pit, it was thriving. The creatures that had torn apart dozens of the hegemony's finest warriors were treating this single human like a welcomed guest. Marcus, meanwhile, was beginning to understand the full scope of what he had stumbled into. The dragons weren't just communicating with him. They were sharing information about their captivity, their treatment, and their deep desire for freedom. Their intelligence was sophisticated enough to understand concepts like imprisonment and liberation. More importantly, they were beginning to look to him as something they had never had before, a leader who understood them as individuals rather than weapons. The Golden Berserker was the first to make the gesture that would change everything. It lowered its head completely to the ground in front of Marcus, exposing the most vulnerable part of its anatomy in the ultimate display of trust and submission. The other two dragons quickly followed suit. Above them, the alien spectators watched in stunned silence as three of the most feared predators in the galaxy submitted to a single unarmed human. Commander Zephyx felt his worldview cracking like damaged armor. This couldn't be happening. It violated every principle of natural hierarchy that the hegemony was built upon, but it was happening, and Marcus was just getting started. The moment the dragons submitted, Marcus felt the weight of their trust settle on his shoulders like a physical presence. These magnificent beings had been enslaved, tortured, and forced to kill for entertainment, yet they were offering him something their captors had never been able to earn: their willing cooperation. He reached out slowly and placed his hand on the Crimson Devastator's massive snout. The dragon's scales were warm to the touch, and he could feel the powerful muscles beneath them relax at his contact. In response, the creature made a deep rumbling sound that vibrated through the arena floor. Not a roar of aggression, but something closer to a purr of contentment. The alien spectators pressed against the viewing windows, their various chittering and clicking sounds creating a cacophony of confusion and disbelief. Never in the 5-year history of the Dragon Pit had they witnessed anything like this. Warriors, criminals, and political prisoners had all met the same fate: swift, violent death. But this human had somehow transformed their ultimate execution method into something that looked almost like a reunion between old friends. "This is impossible." Commander Zephyx's voice cracked with strain as he spoke into the arena's communication system. "Human, what sorcery are you using on our dragons?" Marcus looked up toward the viewing deck, his hand still resting on the Crimson Devastator's snout. "No sorcery, Commander. Just respect. Something your species seems to have forgotten how to show." The accusation hit home. Several of the alien officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. The hegemony's entire philosophy was built on the concept of natural hierarchy. The strong ruled the weak, and intelligence was measured by technological advancement and military might. The idea that they might have been wrong about other species' capabilities was deeply threatening to their worldview. Officer Kralix leaned toward his commander. "Sir, should we activate the emergency protocols? We could flood the arena with sedative gas." "No," Zephyx said firmly. "I want to see how far this human thinks it can push this charade." Below, Marcus was discovering that the dragon's submission was more complex than simple dominance acceptance. Through their continued communication, he was learning about their individual personalities and histories. The Crimson Devastator, whose name in their musical language roughly translated to Fireheart, had been the first captured. It remembered its home world, the volcanic caves where its kind lived in complex social groups. The Shadow Stalker, Nightwing, had been taken as a juvenile and had spent most of its life in captivity. It possessed an almost desperate hunger for knowledge about the outside universe, asking Marcus through gesture and sound about his own world and experiences. The Golden Berserker was the most tragic case. Stormclaw had been specifically bred in captivity, its natural behavioral patterns deliberately altered through pain conditioning and chemical manipulation. Its submission to Marcus was tinged with something approaching worship. Here, finally, was a being who offered guidance without cruelty. As their communication deepened, Marcus began to understand something that made his blood run cold. The dragons weren't just intelligent, they were documenting everything that happened to them. They had detailed memories of every forced battle, every torture session, every casual cruelty inflicted by their captors. They knew exactly how many of their kind had died in this arena. And they knew the names and faces of everyone responsible. They were waiting for justice. The realization must have shown on Marcus's face, because Commander Zephyx's voice took on a sharp edge of concern. "What are you discovering down there, human? What are those creatures telling you?" Marcus stood slowly, his movements still careful and deliberate. All three dragons rose with him, positioning themselves in a protective formation around him. The message was clear. This human was now under their protection. "They're telling me the truth about your entertainment," Marcus called back. "They're telling me about every warrior you forced them to kill, every prisoner you fed to them for sport. They remember all of it." A nervous chattering filled the observation deck. Many of the alien spectators began backing away from the windows, suddenly uncomfortable with being so close to creatures that apparently held grudges. Commander Zephyx tried to maintain his authoritative tone. "Impossible. They're animals. They don't possess memory capabilities for complex events." "Really?" Marcus asked. He turned to Fireheart and made a series of complex gestures, then pointed up toward the observation deck. The response was immediate and terrifying. All three dragons raised their heads toward the aliens and began to vocalize in harmony. But this wasn't the aggressive roaring they had used before. This was something far more sophisticated, a musical pattern that seemed to contain detailed information, like a spoken report or testimony. As the dragon song continued, Marcus provided translation. "Fireheart says that you, Commander Zephyx, were present for his first forced battle 7 months ago. You ordered the handlers to use the neural whips when he tried to retreat into the corner instead of fighting. Stormclaw remembers that you laughed when the previous human prisoner begged for mercy before being torn apart." The musical testimony continued, with each dragon contributing details about specific incidents, specific individuals, specific acts of cruelty. The precision of their recall was devastating. They remembered not just events, but exact conversations, facial expressions, and emotional reactions of their captors. Commander Zephyx's mandibles clicked frantically as he tried to process what he was hearing. If these creatures really possessed this level of intelligence and memory, then the implications for the hegemony were staggering. How many other species had they enslaved based on assumptions about their cognitive limitations? "Sir," Officer Kralix whispered urgently, "the other ships in the fleet are monitoring this broadcast. Word is spreading about what's happening here." That was perhaps the most dangerous development of all. If news of the dragon's intelligence spread throughout the hegemony, it could trigger a crisis of legitimacy that might tear apart their entire civilization. But Marcus wasn't finished. He had discovered something else in his communication with the dragons, something that made him smile with cold satisfaction. "There's something else you should know." "Commander," he called up to the observation deck. "These three aren't the only intelligent dragons you've captured. They've been in contact with others of their kind throughout your fleet. They've been sharing information, planning, waiting for the right moment." The implications hit the alien command staff like a physical blow. If the dragons throughout the fleet were truly intelligent and coordinating with each other, then the hegemony had been keeping an army of hostile prisoners in the heart of their military structure. Fireheart made a deep, questioning sound. Marcus nodded and turned back to the aliens. "They want to know," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the arena. "If you're ready to discuss the terms of their freedom." The observation deck erupted in chaos as the alien officers realized that their ultimate weapons had just declared independence and they had chosen a human to speak for them. The chaos on the observation deck was unlike anything Marcus had ever witnessed. Alien officers of different species were shouting at each other in a dozen languages, their various appendages gesticulating wildly as they tried to process the implications of what they had just learned. Some were calling for immediate evacuation protocols, while others demanded that the dragons be destroyed before they could coordinate further with their imprisoned kin throughout the fleet. Commander Zephyx stood frozen in the center of the pandemonium, his mandibles clicking in a rapid, unconscious rhythm that Marcus recognized as a stress response. The alien leader's entire worldview was crumbling in real time, and he seemed unable to formulate a coherent response to the crisis. Down in the arena, the three dragons were maintaining their protective formation around Marcus, while continuing their complex harmonical communication. Fireheart had positioned himself facing the main viewing window, his massive form radiating quiet authority. Nightwing had moved to cover the arena's secondary exits, while Stormclaw kept watch on the chute Marcus had originally descended through. They weren't just protecting Marcus anymore, they were taking control of their environment. "Sir," Officer Kralix's voice was shrill with panic. "We're receiving reports from across the fleet. Dragon handlers on 17 different ships are reporting unusual behavior from their captives. They're singing, sir. All of them, in perfect synchronization. The implications were staggering. If dragons across the entire hegemony fleet were coordinating, it meant they had been operating a sophisticated communication network right under their captors' noses for years. Every entertainment session, every forced battle, every moment of apparent submission had been part of a longer game. Commander Zephyx finally found his voice. Cut all audio feeds to the other ships. Implement communication blackout protocols immediately. Too late, sir, another officer reported. The Dragon Song is being transmitted on frequencies we didn't know they could access. Our jamming equipment can't block it. Marcus listened to the increasingly frantic reports with grim satisfaction. He had suspected that the Dragon's intelligence went far deeper than simple communication. But even he hadn't anticipated the scope of their hidden capabilities. They had been playing a long game, gathering information and waiting for the right catalyst. He had become that catalyst. Fireheart made a low, questioning sound. Marcus nodded and called up to the observation deck. Fireheart wants to know how many of his people you've scattered across your fleet. He's asking because they're taking inventory of your military assets. The temperature in the observation deck seemed to drop several degrees. The concept of their prisoners conducting intelligence operations was beyond anything the aliens had prepared for. Intelligence operations? Commander Zephix's voice was barely a whisper. Marcus smiled coldly. What did you think they were doing all these years? They've been watching you, learning your routines, studying your weaknesses. Every time you forced them to fight, they were gathering data about your weapons, your tactics, your chain of command. Nightwing added her voice to the conversation, her tones carrying what sounded like a detailed report. Marcus listened carefully, then translated. Nightwing says they know the locations of your ammunition stores, your power generation facilities, and your navigation centers. Stormclaw has been paying particular attention to your shield generators. The alien officers were backing away from the windows now, suddenly aware that they weren't observing captive animals but rather imprisoned military. Strategists who had been conducting surveillance operations for years. Officer Kralix was frantically consulting his instruments. Sir, we're detecting energy fluctuations in the Dragon containment areas throughout the fleet. Their biosignatures they're changing. Changing how? Zephix demanded. Their metabolic rates are increasing, body temperatures rising. It's like they're preparing for action, Marcus finished. You're seeing them drop their pretense of submission. They've been conserving energy and suppressing their natural capabilities to maintain the illusion that they were broken. But they were never broken. They were planning. Fireheart made a sound that was unmistakably in order. The response was immediate. The other two dragons began moving to new positions with military precision. They weren't random animals anymore. They were soldiers taking up tactical positions. Commander Zephix's communication panel erupted with emergency calls from across the fleet. Ship after ship was reporting that their captive dragons were exhibiting coordinated behavior that suggested organized rebellion. Sir, the Devastator-class ship Iron Fang is reporting a containment breach in their dragon pens. 3 dragons have broken free and are moving toward the engine room. The cruiser Death's Edge has lost contact with their security teams in the entertainment sector. Sir, we're receiving a surrender request from the Bone Crusher. Their entire command crew has barricaded themselves on the bridge. The reports continued flooding in, each one more dire than the last. Across the Hegemony fleet, dragons were simultaneously breaking free from their captivity and taking control of the ships that had held them prisoner. Marcus watched the aliens panic with cold satisfaction. This is what happens when you mistake intelligence for stupidity, when you confuse patience for submission. Your prisoners were never defeated. They were gathering strength. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Stormclaw made a series of complex vocalizations that caused even Fireheart to turn and listen with apparent surprise. When the Golden Dragon finished, there was a moment of absolute silence in the arena. What did it say? Commander Zephix demanded, his voice cracking with strain. Marcus looked up at the alien commander with something approaching pity. Stormclaw says this isn't just about the dragons. They've been in contact with prisoners from other species, beings you classified as non-sentient, and condemned to various forms of slavery. The dragons have been serving as communication links between enslaved populations across your entire empire. The implications were beyond catastrophic. If multiple enslaved species were coordinating through dragon communication networks, then the hegemony was facing not just a dragon uprising, but a full-scale rebellion by every oppressed population in their empire. Officer Kralix's instruments were going haywire with incoming reports. "Sir, we're detecting coordinated uprising activities on mining worlds, agricultural colonies, and processing stations. It's not just the fleet. It's everywhere." Commander Zefix stood in stunned silence as his empire began to collapse around him. Everything the hegemony had built was based on the assumption that they were the only truly intelligent species in the galaxy. That assumption was proving not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong. Down in the arena, Fireheart raised his massive head and let out a sound unlike anything Marcus had heard before. It wasn't a roar of aggression or a call of communication. It was something far more significant, a declaration of independence that carried across space to every enslaved being in the hegemony. The age of alien dominance was ending, and it was ending because a single human had shown respect to three supposedly mindless beasts. Marcus smiled as he realized the full scope of what was unfolding. The aliens had thrown him into the dragon pit expecting entertainment. Instead, they had accidentally triggered the liberation of an entire galaxy. The dragons had found their champion, and he had found his army. Marcus had heard enough panicked reports from the observation deck to understand that the hegemony fleet was tearing itself apart from within, but he wasn't content to simply be a spectator to the revolution he had accidentally triggered. If he was going to be the champion of an enslaved galaxy, he needed to take a more active role in shaping the outcome. He turned to Fireheart and made a series of gestures they had developed during their communication. The massive dragon's response was immediate, a low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to carry complex instructions to his companions. Nightwing and Stormclaw began moving with purpose, no longer content to maintain defensive positions. "What are you doing down there?" Commander Zefix's voice had lost all pretense of authority. He sounded like a being who had watched his universe turn upside down and was struggling to maintain any sense of control. Marcus looked up at the observation deck with calm confidence. "I'm accepting my role as their representative in negotiations. Unless you prefer to deal with them directly?" To emphasize the point, Stormclaw moved closer to the base of the viewing windows and reared up on his hind legs. At his full height, the golden dragon was nearly as tall as the observation deck itself. His claws scraped against the reinforced walls as he examined the transparent aluminum barriers that separated him from his former tormentors. The scratching sound sent most of the alien spectators fleeing toward the exits. Only Commander Zefix and a handful of his senior officers remained, and they were pressed as far back from the windows as possible. "Those barriers are rated to withstand plasma cannon fire," Officer Kralix said, but his voice carried no conviction. "They can't possibly break through." Marcus had learned enough about dragon capabilities to know that the aliens were seriously underestimating their former prisoners. "Fireheart," he said, "show them what you're really capable of." The Crimson Devastator moved to the center of the arena and began a deep, rhythmic breathing pattern. Marcus had seen similar techniques used by the big cats at his grandfather's sanctuary when they were preparing for extraordinary physical efforts. The dragon's scales began to glow with an inner light, growing brighter with each breath. "Impossible," Commander Zefix breathed. "Their bioluminescence is purely decorative. It serves no functional purpose." But as Fireheart's breathing intensified, the temperature in the arena began to rise noticeably. The dragon's internal metabolism was shifting into a state that their captors had never witnessed because they had never seen a dragon operating at full capacity. When Fireheart finally exhaled, it wasn't the simple roar the aliens expected. Instead, a stream of superheated plasma erupted from his throat, not the primitive fire-breathing of mythology, but a focused energy beam that could melt through advanced hull armor. The plasma stream struck the arena wall directly below the observation deck. The reinforced materials that had contained countless prisoners simply vaporized on contact, leaving a gaping hole that led directly into the ship's internal corridors. Above them, emergency alarms began blaring throughout the vessel. The aliens' expressions had moved beyond shock into something approaching terror. Everything they thought they knew about dragon capabilities had just proven to be catastrophically wrong. "That's why you kept them sedated and malnourished," Marcus realized aloud. You knew they were capable of this, but you convinced yourselves they were just animals to justify what you were doing to them. Commander Zephyx was frantically issuing orders to his remaining staff. Seal the entertainment decks. Initiate emergency lockdown protocols. Contact the other ships and warn them about enhanced Dragon capabilities. But it was too late for warnings. The communication channels were filled with reports of similar breaches occurring throughout the fleet. Dragons everywhere were revealing abilities their captors had never imagined. Abilities that had been suppressed through systematic malnutrition and chemical restraints. Nightwing approached the hole Fireheart had created and peered into the corridor beyond. Her vocalizations carried the musical equivalent of tactical information, ship layout, guard positions, critical system locations. The dragons had been mapping their prison for years, preparing for exactly this moment. Marcus made his decision. "I'm going with them," he announced, moving toward the breach in the arena wall. "Human." Commander Zephyx's voice cracked with desperate authority. "You cannot leave the arena. You are our prisoner." Marcus paused and looked back at the observation deck with something approaching pity. "Commander, you threw me in here to be executed by creatures you thought were mindless animals. Instead, I found allies who have been planning the liberation of your victims for years. I'm not your prisoner anymore. You're theirs." To emphasize the point, Stormclaw moved to the base of the observation deck and began examining the structural supports with obvious intent. The Golden Dragon's enhanced claws, no longer dulled by captivity and poor nutrition, were making deep gouges in the supposedly impregnable materials. The remaining aliens fled en masse, leaving only Commander Zephyx and Officer Kralix cowering behind their control panels. Marcus stepped through the breach into the ship's corridors, his 3 dragon allies flanking him like an honor guard. The emergency lighting cast strange shadows on the walls, and the air was filled with the sound of distant battles as other freed prisoners fought to liberate their companions. The ship's internal layout was exactly as Nightwing had described. Through her musical communications, Marcus found himself moving through corridors with the confidence of someone who had studied detailed blueprints. The dragons had been gathering intelligence for so long that they knew the vessel better than some of its crew members. Their first objective was the central communication array. If they could control the ship's communications, they could coordinate with the uprising across the fleet and potentially contact other oppressed populations throughout the galaxy. They encountered their first group of alien guards at a corridor junction. The security team was a mixed unit, various species that had been recruited or conquered by the hegemony and pressed into service. When they saw Marcus approaching with 3 dragons, their reactions varied dramatically. Some raised their weapons in desperate defiance. Others simply dropped their equipment and fled. But a few, members of species that Marcus suspected had their own grievances against the hegemony, stood aside and let the group pass. Fireheart paused as they passed one of these non-hostile guards, a reptilian being whose scales bore the scarring patterns Marcus was learning to associate with former slavery. The dragon made a low, questioning sound. The guard responded in what seemed to be a different language entirely, but Fireheart appeared to understand. The dragon turned to Marcus and made a gesture that clearly meant, "Friend." Marcus nodded and addressed the guard directly. "Your people, are they ready to be free?" The reptilian being's eyes widened in surprise at being spoken to as an equal, rather than a subordinate. After a moment of shock, he nodded vigorously and pointed toward the ship's lower decks where, Marcus realized, other enslaved beings were probably being held. The revolution was spreading beyond even the dragon's careful planning. Species throughout the ship were beginning to recognize that liberation was possible, and they were choosing sides. As they continued toward the communication array, Marcus felt the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders. He had become more than just a prisoner who had survived the dragon pit. He was now the focal point of a galactic uprising, the symbol of resistance against an empire built on the systematic oppression of intelligent beings. The aliens had thought they were executing a primitive human. Instead, they had crowned a revolutionary. The central communication array was located in the heart of the hegemony battleship, a massive chamber filled with sophisticated equipment that linked the vessel to the entire fleet and, beyond that, to the far-flung reaches of the alien empire. When Marcus and his dragon allies reached the heavily fortified entrance, they found it defended by the ship's elite guard, warriors from a dozen different species, all armed with the most advanced weapons the hegemony could provide. But the defenders' resolve crumbled the moment they saw 3 dragons moving in perfect coordination with a human leader. Some fled immediately, abandoning their posts rather than face creatures they had believed were mindless killing machines. Others attempted to fight, only to discover that their weapons were largely ineffective against dragons operating at full capacity. Fireheart's plasma breath could melt through their energy shields like they were made of paper. Nightwing moved with speed and grace that made their targeting systems useless. Stormclaw's enhanced strength allowed him to tear through their defensive positions like they were constructed from cardboard, but what demoralized the defenders most was seeing other enslaved species within their own ranks turning against them. The revelation that the dragons were intelligent had triggered a cascade of recognition throughout the ship. Beings who had been classified as worker drones or service animals were revealing their own hidden capabilities and choosing to join the revolution. Within minutes, Marcus found himself in control of the communication center with a growing army of liberated beings at his disposal. The first thing he did was open channels to the other ships in the fleet. The responses he received painted a picture of an empire in complete collapse. On vessel after vessel, dragon-led uprisings were succeeding beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The creatures that had been kept as entertainment were revealing themselves to be sophisticated military tacticians who had spent years planning coordinated strikes against their captors. But the dragons weren't the only ones rising up. The communication network they had established had connected enslaved populations across the galaxy, and the signal for revolution was spreading faster than the hegemony could respond. Marcus activated the fleet-wide communication system and found himself addressing not just the hegemony forces, but every intelligent being within range of their transmitters. "This is Marcus Chen of Earth," he began, his voice carrying across space to hundreds of ships and thousands of worlds. "I'm speaking to you from what used to be a hegemony battleship, but is now the first vessel in the fleet of the liberated. The age of oppression is ending." Fireheart added his voice to the broadcast, his deep harmonic tones carrying meanings that translated across species barriers. Nightwing and Stormclaw joined in, creating a symphony of liberation that reached enslaved beings throughout the galaxy. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Reports flooded in from across the Empire as populations that had been suppressed for generations suddenly found their voices. Mining colonies were declaring independence. Agricultural worlds were expelling their overseers. Processing stations were shutting down their operations and demanding recognition as sovereign territories. Commander Zephix's voice crackled through the ship's internal communication system, his authority now reduced to desperate pleading. "Human, you don't understand what you've done. Without the hegemony's guidance, these species will destroy themselves. They need our structure, our leadership." Marcus listened to the alien leader's protests with something approaching pity. Even faced with the complete collapse of his worldview, Zephix was clinging to the same arrogant assumptions that had created this crisis. "Commander," Marcus replied, his voice carrying throughout the ship, "you never provided guidance. You provided oppression. You never offered leadership. You imposed dominance. The difference is that real leadership requires understanding and respect, qualities your species apparently never developed." The truth was becoming clear to Marcus as he watched the liberated beings around him organize themselves with remarkable efficiency. These species hadn't needed the hegemony's guidance. They had been perfectly capable of sophisticated cooperation and planning. They had simply been prevented from demonstrating those capabilities by their oppressors. The dragons, in particular, were revealing themselves to be natural coordinators. Their communication abilities allowed them to facilitate cooperation between species that had never been able to communicate directly before. They were serving as translators, mediators, and strategic advisors for the growing coalition of liberated worlds. Fireheart approached Marcus with what appeared to be a formal request. Through their developed communication system, the dragon was asking for permission to contact the homeworlds of all the enslaved species and coordinate a galaxy-wide liberation effort. Marcus realized that he was being offered something unprecedented in galactic history and the chance to become the acknowledged leader of a unified rebellion against oppression. The dragons, despite their own superior capabilities, were recognizing something in him that made them willing to accept his leadership. "Why me?" Marcus asked Fireheart directly. "You're more intelligent than I am. more powerful with better understanding of galactic politics. Why do you want a human to lead this revolution? Fireheart's response was complex, involving not just sounds but subtle body language that Marcus had learned to interpret. The dragon was explaining something about human psychology that even Marcus hadn't fully understood. Humans, Fireheart indicated, possessed a unique combination of traits that made them ideal revolutionary leaders. They had the intelligence to understand complex situations, but also the emotional flexibility to empathize with beings completely unlike themselves. They could be ruthless when necessary, but they also had an almost instinctive drive to protect the vulnerable. Most importantly, humans seemed to have a natural resistance to the kind of power corruption that had destroyed other species' attempts at galactic leadership. Where other intelligent races tended to either become tyrants or withdraw into isolationism when given power, humans maintained their connection to other beings. The dragons had been studying Marcus since the moment he entered their pit, analyzing not just his actions but his underlying motivations. They had concluded that humans represented something the galaxy had never seen before, a species capable of wielding power without losing their fundamental compassion. Marcus felt the weight of that assessment and the responsibility it implied. But as he looked around at the liberated beings working together to build something new from the ruins of the hegemony, he realized that he was ready to accept that responsibility. Fireheart, he said, tell our allies across the galaxy that the Age of Empires is ending. We're not building a new hierarchy to replace the old one. We're creating something that's never existed before, a galactic community based on cooperation rather than domination. The dragon's response was a harmonic sound that carried joy, hope, and something approaching reverence. Within hours, that sound was being transmitted across the galaxy, carrying the message of liberation to every enslaved world and oppressed population. The aliens had thrown a human into a dragon pit expecting entertainment. Instead, they had accidentally created the catalyst for the birth of a new kind of galactic civilization, one where intelligence was measured not by the ability to dominate others, but by the wisdom to recognize the value in all conscious beings. Marcus Chen had entered the arena as a prisoner. He was leaving it as the first leader of a free galaxy, with 3 dragons as his first and most trusted advisors. The revolution had begun, and humanity had found its place among the stars not as conquerors but as liberators.